The night Lena Ward kicked her crippled husband out of their mansion, rain poured like the sky was mourning him. Ethan sat in his wheelchair at the doorway, half in shadow, half in pain, as movers carried out boxes he once built their dreams in. She didn't flinch. She didn't even look back. Her diamond earrings caught the porch light while she held another man's hand. Nathan Cross, the rich man who promised her the world. Neighbors whispered that she had finally escaped struggle, that she had upgraded. They called Ethan the poor disabled one. They didn't know he owned the company Nathan worked for. He smiled faintly as their taillights disappeared into the night. Calm, silent, dangerous. Because sometimes the man they call broken is the one holding every string. But if Lena had known whose name was written on Nathan's paychecks, if she had known what Ethan planned behind that quiet smile, would she still have laughed when she slammed that door? Would she still have called him poor? Or would she have realized too late that the man she threw away was about to destroy everything she loved? The day Ethan Ward lost his legs, the world called him a hero. The explosion tore through the lower wing of Ward Tech Manufacturing, a flash of fire, steel, and screams. But he didn't hesitate. He'd seen his workers trapped under debris, sprinted into the smoke, and dragged two men out before the final blast threw him backward into a wall of flame. When the paramedics found him, his hands were burnt, his body twisted, but his eyes, Wana, were calm. He didn't ask if he would walk again. He asked if everyone else survived. That was Ethan. Logic before emotion, heart before pride. 3 months later, the city gave him a medal. His wife, Lena, smiled for cameras, kissed his cheek, and held his hand through every photo. She called him my miracle. But behind the flashbulbs, behind her perfect lipstick smile, there was a tremor, a calculation, because kindness in her world was weakness. And now her husband, the once towering man who built an empire with his hands, sat in a wheelchair. Their mansion in the hills had glass walls that reflected everything. His silence, her resentment, their slow collapse. At dinner, he tried to keep it normal. "You don't have to stay up with me every night," he said gently. She didn't look up. "I'm not staying up. I'm working." "On what?" She shrugged. "Something that doesn't involve pity." That night, when he reached for her hand, she pulled away. Lena had met Nathan Cross 2 weeks earlier at a charity gala Ethan was supposed to attend but couldn't. Nathan, the charming investor with the silver watch and the kind of confidence that smelled like money. He complimented her speech, her dress, her loneliness. It started with coffee, then dinners, then hotel rooms under fake names. Lena told herself it wasn't betrayal, it was survival. She deserved excitement. She deserved the life Ethan could no longer give. Ethan sensed the shift. Her perfume changed. Her laughter changed. Her eyes no longer lingered when he spoke. But he said nothing. Because men like Ethan didn't accuse, they observed. Weeks later, his accountant mentioned strange withdrawals. "Mrs. Ward transferred $70,000 to an unknown account," the man said quietly. Ethan didn't flinch. Keep watching. He didn't need confrontation. He needed truth. When Lena came home that night, her hair wet, her dress new, she found Ethan sitting in the study. Lights dim, a single lamp casting his reflection in the window. "You're late," he said softly. "Dinner with clients," she replied, voice flat. "Which clients?" "The ones that make money." He nodded once. No anger, no accusation, just a silence so heavy it made her fidget. In that silence, he saw the woman he'd married vanish. That night, he whispered to himself, "Maybe I was never her miracle. Maybe I was just her moment." 2 months later, she filed for separation, claiming emotional neglect. Her lawyer argued that Ethan's condition made her the caretaker of a man who could no longer meet marital obligations. The court looked at him with pity. He smiled back. Pity was his weapon now. Lena sold the house, moved in with Nathan, and the world that once praised her for standing by her husband now envied her for upgrading. They didn't know she had married a man whose paychecks were signed by the husband she betrayed. Because Nathan Cross, the self-made millionaire, worked under Ward Tech Holdings, the conglomerate quietly controlled by one man, Ethan Ward. And Ethan? He didn't scream, didn't chase. didn't beg. He built silence around him like a fortress. He began moving his chess pieces, quietly, surgically, invisibly. The kind man who once saved lives was about to destroy them. It was the first morning Lena woke up beside Nathan Cross as Mrs. Cross. The bed smelled of money and perfume, not love. Sunlight fell on silk sheets and her diamond wedding band, larger than the one Ethan gave her, glinted like victory. Nathan was already on his phone, voice sharp, commanding. "I'll call the board later. Tell procurement to push the contract to WardTech Holdings." The words made her pause. WardTech. The name still sounded like a ghost. She smiled faintly, pretending not to hear it. She told herself it was coincidence, that life just had a dark sense of humor. Nathan hung up and turned to her. "You like it here?" "It's different," she said, pulling the sheet closer to her skin. He kissed her shoulder, distracted. "Different's good. You'll get used to better." Better. The word echoed like a promise, but felt like a contract she didn't read. By noon, they were in the penthouse living room. Marble floors, gold fixtures, city skyline that looked like it bowed to them. Reporters had written about their fairy tale marriage. Her friends from the past sent messages full of envy and emojis. She laughed at them all, wine glass in hand, convinced she had finally escaped the life of pity and patience. What she didn't know was that Nathan's voice on that morning call had been recorded, and the man listening on the other end, miles away behind his mahogany desk at WardTech Global Headquarters, was Ethan Ward. He didn't speak. He just watched. Watched Lena laughing in an interview on a muted TV. Watched Nathan holding her hand like he owned her. His assistant entered quietly. "Sir, the Cross Holdings merger paperwork is ready for signature." Ethan turned his chair toward the city skyline. "Good," he said. "Make sure their payroll clears on Friday." "Yes, sir." "And move their debt exposure to internal review." The assistant paused. "All of it?" "All of it," Ethan replied, calm as still water. He never raised his voice. He never smiled. But from that office overlooking downtown, he began dismantling their world one silent document at a time. Nathan's company, Cross and Ivy Investments, lived on loans from WardTech's financial division. A shell built on paper Ethan signed. All it took was one instruction, and every luxury Nathan flaunted would start bleeding quietly. At first, the changes were invisible. A pending transfer here. A supplier delay there. Then a message from a partner. Contract paused, internal audit. Nathan frowned but shrugged it off. Happens all the time. Lena didn't notice. She was too busy shopping, attending galas, living the dream she'd once mocked Ethan for not being able to afford. At one charity dinner, a journalist asked, "Mrs. Cross, is it true your husband once worked for WardTech Holdings?" Lena's smile froze. "Worked? No. He's an investor." Nathan chuckled, lifting his glass. "I'm more than that." They laughed, but Ethan watched from home, alone, quiet. Every laugh carved him a little deeper, and yet sharpened his focus. Late that night, he opened an old photo folder. Lena, smiling, wearing the same earrings she now wore for Nathan. His reflection in the dark glass looked like a stranger. Grace, his sister, walked in with quiet steps. "You're still awake." He didn't turn. "Sleep's expensive when you're planning justice." Grace's voice softened. "You're not that kind of man, Ethan." He looked at her reflection. "I wasn't. She made sure of that." The next morning, Nathan arrived at his office to find confusion. His CFO looked pale. "Our account's been flagged. There's a pending audit from WardTech Finance. They want full documentation of our subsidiary network." Nathan laughed. "Tell them we're clean." "They already know we're not," the CFO whispered. Lena called him hours later, panic slipping into her voice. "What's happening? The cards aren't going through. My stylist said the payment declined." "Relax," Nathan said, forcing a smirk. "It's a glitch." But when his phone buzzed with a bank alert, asset freeze, internal hold by WardTech Compliance Division, his smirk vanished. Ethan watched it all from his screen, quiet as ever. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He just adjusted his cufflinks and whispered, "Level 1 complete." That night, he received an email from his lawyer, Thomas Drake, subject, Phase 2. Ready. Body. We found enough to sink them both. Awaiting your word. Ethan closed his eyes and breathed slowly. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled. He whispered one word, not to anyone in particular, just to the silence that once comforted him. Proceed. Lena, meanwhile, slept soundly beside Nathan, unaware that every light in their world was already dimming. And for the first time in months, Ethan slept too. Not because he was at peace, but because revenge finally had a heartbeat. It began with whispers. A journalist in Manhattan posted a small story online. Corporate audit links Cross and Ivy investments to internal irregularities at Wartech Holdings. The article barely made the third page of the business section, but within 48 hours it spread like perfume in a crowded elevator. Investors began calling. Partners pulled back. Reporters camped outside Nathan's glass tower asking questions he couldn't answer. Ethan watched the first headline appear on his office monitor. He didn't blink. Grace stood by the window, arms folded. You really did it, he spoke softly. Not yet. That's just the smell of smoke. The fire comes later. Nathan's world was crumbling in slow motion. Every contract he'd bragged about was suddenly under review. His private accounts showed mysterious holds, and clients who used to toast him stopped returning calls. Lena tried to hold her posture, designer dress, flawless hair, but panic has a way of dulling diamonds. One evening she found him pacing the penthouse, phone glued to his ear. I don't care what compliance says, Nathan barked. We have nothing to hide. Lena hovered in the doorway. What's going on? He ended the call with a slam. Someone's sabotaging us. Who? He poured a drink. Wardtech. They're strangling our cash flow. Someone up there's pulling strings. She forced a laugh. Then sue them. Nathan looked at her, eyes sharp. You think I haven't tried? Miles away, in a quiet office filled with legal binders, Ethan and Thomas Drake sat opposite each other. Thomas slid a folder across the desk. Phase 3. We've traced Lena's signature on the fraudulent transfers she made before the divorce. She used his funds to buy into Nathan's company. That makes her an accessory. Ethan turned the page slowly. Accessory to what? To her own destruction. He closed the folder. Leak it anonymously. Let the law chase them while we prepare the courtroom. The following week, tabloids exploded. Wife of paralyzed CEO in financial scandal with lover's firm. Photos of Lena and Nathan at galas splashed across every gossip column. Reporters used words like affair, embezzlement, betrayal. Her friends stopped picking up her calls. Ethan stayed silent, refusing interviews. When a journalist cornered him outside Wartech headquarters, he simply said, no comments, but truth has a schedule. By the time the subpoena arrived at Nathan's doorstep, the penthouse felt like a prison. You told me you owned everything, Lena shouted. I do, Nathan roared back. Or I did. Somebody's turned my own lawyers against me. You promised me security. I promised you money, he snapped. You should have kept your husband happy. Maybe he wouldn't have started this war. The words hit her harder than any slap. She walked to the balcony, staring down at the city that once applauded her. For the first time, she felt something new. Fear. Court day arrived under gray skies. Reporters lined the marble steps, cameras flashing like gunfire. Ethan entered quietly, wheeled by Grace, wearing a dark tailored suit. He looked serene. Nathan and Lena stood together at the opposite table, visibly cracking under the weight of attention. Judge Raymond Cole glanced over the files. This is unusual. Mrs. Cross, Mr. Cross, the documents before me show substantial fraud. Funds moved from Mr. Ward's holdings were used to establish your business. Do you deny this? Nathan straightened his tie. We were married then. That was community property. The judge arched an eyebrow. You weren't married to Mr. Ward. Lena's breath caught. I meant, Cole continued. Mr. Drake, your evidence? Thomas stood, calm as a surgeon. Your Honor, Exhibit 12. DNA test results confirming both minor children are not biologically Mr. Ward's. Exhibit 13, marriage certificate proving the date overlap. Exhibit 14, employment contracts proving Mr. Cross was and remains a direct employee of Wartech Holdings. making all his assets subject to corporate investigation. A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled furiously. Lena's knees weakened. Nathan's jaw tightened. Ethan's face didn't move. He just watched them, two people who once laughed over his silence, now drowning in it. Judge Cole exhaled slowly. Mrs. Cross, you stand accused of marital fraud, financial misconduct, and perjury. Mr. Cross, of corporate theft and falsification of records. You both may speak before sentencing. Lena tried to speak, but only sobs came. Nathan muttered something about revenge, but the judge silenced him with a look. Ethan finally spoke, voice low but clear. Your Honor, I ask no compensation, just one request, full custody of my name. Cole nodded gravely. Granted. He turned to the clerk. Remove the children's last names from Ward's records as per DNA confirmation. They are to be re-registered under biological paternity. Lena gasped. You can't. They're my babies. Ethan's eyes were cold. They're not mine. The gavel hit like thunder. Cameras flashed. The story hit every major outlet within the hour. Betrayed husband wins brutal court battle. Ex-wife and lover lose everything. When it was over, Ethan rolled out of the courthouse into the crisp afternoon light. Grace walked beside him silently. You finally got justice, she whispered. He watched the reporters swarm the stairs behind him. Justice? He murmured. No, just balance. Inside the courtroom, Nathan and Lena sat motionless, surrounded by the shards of the life they'd stolen. And somewhere, deep in the city skyline, WardTech's neon logo flickered in the twilight, a quiet reminder that kindness isn't weakness, it's patience, sharpened. The matter didn't end in that courtroom. It only changed location. When the headlines faded and the city turned its eyes to fresher scandals, Ethan went back to the one place that still belonged entirely to him, his company. WardTech's corridors were quiet now, rebuilt after the explosion, gleaming like new bones. Workers nodded with a mix of awe and guilt when he passed. Everyone knew what had happened. Everyone knew who had won. In his office, the walls hummed with low jazz and the city lights drew patterns across his desk. Thomas Drake entered, carrying 2 folders. It's done, he said. The liquidation order, the repossession, the offshore closures. Cross and Lena have nothing left. Ethan flipped through the pages slowly. The house? Seized? The vehicles? All registered under WardTech assets, recalled. Their accounts? Drained to pay restitution. He signed each line with the precision of a surgeon. His signature was clean, elegant, final. Thomas hesitated. You could stop now. Ethan didn't look up. Could, but forgiveness is a currency they never earned. That night, Lena and Nathan packed the last of their things into a rented car. The penthouse was stripped bare. Only the echo of their ambition remained. Nathan's phone rang with another demand notice. He threw it against the wall. He's destroying us for sport. Lena sat on the floor, mascara streaked, clutching her phone as if it could still connect her to the life she'd lost. He was supposed to be weak, Nathan laughed bitterly. He's crippled, not blind. You gave him the map. They left the city under streetlights that no longer belonged to them. Ethan's revenge didn't stop at their finances. He reached into their future and folded it in half. He instructed his legal team to block their employment in every subsidiary linked to WardTech. Every application they filed came back with a polite rejection. Position filled. Requirements not met. Conflict of interest. He donated a large sum to the hospital that treated his burns. In Lena's name. Every donor plaque would bear her name under the words funded by WardTech's Recovery Initiative. People saw the plaque and smiled. She saw it online and trembled. It was humiliation written in gold. Weeks later, she found work at a low-end PR firm under her maiden name. On her first day, the new manager handed her a contract with a subtle smile. Welcome aboard, Mrs. WardTech. She froze. He leaned closer. Yes, our new ownership structure traces back to Ethan Ward's foundation. He's quite the silent philanthropist. She quit the same afternoon. Nathan didn't fare better. His old colleagues avoided him. Banks blacklisted him. The penthouse went to auction. Reporters camped outside long enough to capture his last quote, before disappearing into anonymity. Some men build empires, others build traps. Months passed. Winter rolled through the city again. Ethan spent Christmas evening alone in his apartment overlooking the skyline. He poured a glass of wine, stared at the quiet lights, and for the first time in years, felt something close to peace. Grace came by later with her son. The boy ran to him, wrapping his small arms around Ethan's waist. "Mom says you're a hero." He smiled faintly. "No, just someone who stopped pretending pain makes you holy." When they left, he wheeled himself to the window. Down below, the city looked smaller, quieter, as if it had exhaled. Across town, Lena sat in a tiny apartment with a broken heater, scrolling through old photos of Ethan. Every image was a mirror she couldn't break. She whispered his name once. Not out of love, but regret. Nathan slept in the next room, snoring through debt collector nightmares. She stared at the ceiling until dawn, realizing the truth that had always been waiting for her. She hadn't just lost a man. She'd lost the only person who ever looked at her and saw something worth saving. Ethan's revenge wasn't loud. It didn't leave bodies. It left understanding, the cruel kind that stays. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and whispered into the silence. Some wars aren't fought with bullets. They're fought with memory. Outside, the Ward Tech logo glowed across the skyline like a verdict. The kind man they betrayed had kept his promise to the world. He built something that would outlive them. And somewhere, beneath that same light, Lena and Nathan lived in the long shadow of a man they once called poor. Ethan woke before dawn, the city still black and quiet beneath his window. For the first time in years, the silence wasn't empty. It was earned. He wheeled himself to the desk, opened his laptop, and read the message blinking in his inbox. Final audit complete. Cross and Ivy struck from all corporate records. Full control restored. He closed it without smiling. Victory, he had learned, didn't feel like triumph. It felt like balance returning to a world that had tipped too far. Grace arrived with coffee. "You've rebuilt everything." "Not everything," he said. "Some things are meant to stay broken." She watched him for a moment, the lines on his face softened by fatigue. "You could start over. There are people who still care about you." He shook his head. "Starting over means pretending it never happened. I'd rather remember." At the same hour across the river, Lena woke to the smell of damp paint in the one-bedroom apartment she now shared with Nathan. The ceiling leaked. The heat barely worked. Nathan was gone before sunrise, leaving only a note on the counter. "Don't wait up." She didn't. She sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through news she could barely afford to read. Every article still mentioned Ethan Ward, the philanthropist, the visionary, the survivor. His story had become the city's favorite myth. The crippled husband who built an empire from kindness and conquered betrayal with silence. Lena threw the phone down. The sound startled her son, the only child who still called her mother. He wasn't Nathan's or Ethan's, but a boy born from another lie she'd buried years ago. He came out of his room rubbing his eyes. "Are we moving again?" She pulled him close and said nothing. She didn't know where to go anymore. That evening, Ethan returned to the old factory site where it had all begun. The building had been rebuilt into a research lab for prosthetics funded by Ward Tech's new foundation. Engineers greeted him like a legend. He walked slowly, unsteadily on mechanical legs still in prototype phase. Each step clicked softly on the floor. A technician handed him a folder. "We'll have the next version ready next month. Lighter frame, better balance." Ethan looked out at the floor of young engineers and welders. Keep it cheap enough for workers who can't afford miracles. He left the lab and drove himself home through streets glittering with rain. At a red light, he noticed a woman standing at a bus stop, her shoulders hunched against the cold. The curve of her jaw, the tilt of her head, it was Lena. For a moment, he almost didn't recognize her. The makeup, the diamonds, the arrogance were gone. She looked ordinary, human. Their eyes met across the glass in rain. She froze, lips parting as if to speak. The light turned green. He didn't roll down his window. He didn't wave. He simply nodded once, a gesture that was neither forgiveness nor cruelty, just closure. When his car pulled away, she stood trembling under the streetlight, watching the taillights fade into the dark. She realized then that revenge hadn't killed her. It had erased her. At home, Ethan poured a drink, stared at the city, and thought of how far the line between mercy and justice had stretched. Thomas called to say another charity wanted him to speak. He declined. Let the work speak. He sat in silence, the kind that hums when there's nothing left to prove. In another part of the city, Nathan's creditors finally cornered him. There were no cameras now, no admirers, just the echo of his own arrogance. He vanished quietly, leaving Lena to answer doors she couldn't lock. By spring, Wardtech's foundation launched a new project, Scholarships for Workers' Children. The press wanted a quote. Ethan gave them 5 words that traveled farther than any headline. Kindness remembers, so does betrayal. He visited his mother's grave that weekend, laid down white roses, and stayed until the wind turned cold. I did what you couldn't, he whispered. I learned when to stop saving people. As dust settled, he walked back to the car on mechanical legs, steady and deliberate. Behind him the city glowed, the same city that had watched him burn, rebuild, and rise again. No applause, no audience. Just the quiet grace of a man who turned pain into empire. And far away in a dim apartment, Lena stared at the glowing Wardtech billboard through her window, the one she once thought was her crown. It looked like judgment written in light. Ethan Ward never spoke her name again. He didn't need to. The world already remembered it, for all the wrong reasons. By the end of that year, Wardtech's name had become a kind of parable whispered in boardrooms and written between the lines of business magazines. The story of the man who lost everything, smiled, and took it all back. Ethan kept his days simple. Meetings in the morning, rehab in the afternoon, long walks through the park at dusk on prosthetic legs that clicked quietly against the pavement. The city had learned to look at him differently now, not with pity, but with a kind of cautious respect. One night, he returned home to find a letter on his doorstep. No return address. Inside was a single sentence written in Lena's handwriting. I finally understand what you meant by silence. He read it twice, folded it carefully, and set it on the mantel beside an old photo of the factory crew he'd saved. Then he poured himself a drink and turned off every light. Some words, he thought, were better in the dark. Across town, Lena worked late at a diner off 42nd Street. She wore a name tag with her maiden name and smiled for tips. When a delivery driver recognized her from an old magazine cover, she said, "That wasn't me." The lie came easily now, but it didn't sting anymore. It was just habit. She went home to a small apartment where the rent was due and Nathan's name was still on the mailbox, even though he hadn't been seen in months. Sometimes late at night, she watched news clips of Wardtech's new projects, the prosthetic program, the scholarships, and waited for a glimpse of Ethan. She never got one. Ethan, meanwhile, spent his evenings in the lab. The new prosthetic design was lighter, faster, quieter. The engineers gathered around as he stood without support for the first time. Applause broke out. He simply nodded, adjusted his stance, and said, "Good. Now make it better." After everyone left, he stayed behind, watching his reflection in the window, standing, steady, whole. For a long time, he didn't move. The revenge that had once driven him now felt small compared to the quiet discipline that had replaced it. When he finally stepped outside, the night air carried the faint hum of the city. The same rhythm that had once mocked him now sounded almost like music. He walked to the edge of the terrace and looked down at the glow of the Wardtech sign. Grace joined him, a cup of tea in hand. "They still talk about you," she said. "The papers call you the man who rebuilt Mercy." He smiled faintly. "Mercy's overrated." "Maybe," she said, "but it keeps the world from freezing." They stood in silence until the wind shifted. In the distance, sirens wailed and streetlights flickered. Life went on. Ethan returned to his desk, opened a drawer, and took out an envelope he'd kept sealed for months. The DNA results, the court papers, every document that had burned holes through his chest. He fed them, one by one, into the shredder until nothing was left but confetti. When he was done, he exhaled, long and steady, as if breathing out the last of a storm. The next morning, he drove through the neighborhood where he and Lena had once lived. The mansion was gone, replaced by glass apartments. In front of the lot stood a billboard for a WardTech housing project, affordable homes for rebuilding lives. He parked for a moment, watching workers pour concrete, and thought of the day he'd been carried out of that same address in a wheelchair. He didn't go inside. He didn't need to. That evening, he stood on the balcony of his penthouse, the skyline burning gold under the setting sun. He took off his ring, the one Lena had given back to him during the divorce, and placed it on the rail. It caught the last light before falling quietly into the river below. Grace called later to say the hospital had named a new rehabilitation wing after him. He thanked her and said he'd visit soon. Then he closed his phone, turned off the lights, and let the city glow without him. In the diner across town, a young couple sat at Lena's table, arguing softly about money. The man said, "Love doesn't pay bills." The woman said, "Neither does pride." Lena refilled their coffee and whispered, "Sometimes it's better to lose everything before you understand what's worth keeping." They didn't hear her, but she said it anyway. When she stepped outside after closing, snow had begun to fall. Quiet, slow, endless. Somewhere beyond the lights, WardTech's tower blinked through the mist. She pulled her coat tight and walked toward the subway, her footsteps fading into the hum of the city. Up in his office, Ethan watched the same snow drift past his window. He raised his glass once more to the skyline and whispered the last words he would ever speak of her. "Kindness is not weakness. It's patience with a deadline." The wind carried the words into the night, scattering them over the city that had seen him broken, betrayed, and reborn. And under that same cold sky, two people who once shared a life now shared only silence, one rebuilt by it, the other buried beneath it. Ethan's world had grown quiet again, but it wasn't the lonely kind of silence. It was the kind that followed storms, when even the wind seemed afraid to stir what had already been settled. He spent his mornings walking through the new WardTech Rehabilitation Center. Rows of patients, each learning to move again on the prosthetics his company built, greeted him like a living mirror of his own past. He would stop beside them, adjust a strap, offer a nod, then move on. He didn't make speeches anymore. His presence said everything words couldn't. Outside, the building's glass facade reflected the whole city. It was strange, he thought, how glass could be both window and shield. That was what he had become. A man others looked through, never realizing how much he still saw. That afternoon, Grace found him in his office, staring at a prototype resting on the table. "They're asking you to speak at the Global Innovation Summit," she said. He didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed on the carbon frame, the same model that had replaced his legs. "If I go," he said, "I'll only talk about failure." "That's what they want," she said softly. "You make failure look survivable." He smiled faintly and looked out at the skyline. The snow from the night before had melted into mist, wrapping the skyscrapers like a veil. Maybe survival's all that's left to teach. Across town, in a building that smelled of detergent and metal, Lena wiped down tables under the yellow light of a late shift. Her manager told her she could go early, but she stayed. She liked the sound of the diner after midnight, just the hum of refrigerators and the faint hiss of the coffee machine. The silence reminded her of Ethan's old office, the one she used to walk into wearing perfume that wasn't for him. Sometimes she thought she could still hear his voice in her head. "Kindness isn't weakness." It used to sound like an insult. Now it felt like a prayer. She finished cleaning, turned off the lights, and stepped outside. The air was cool and clear, and for a second she thought she saw him, tall, steady, watching from across the street. But when she blinked, it was only a man waiting for a cab. She smiled to herself, sad and small, and kept walking. Nathan was gone completely now. No calls, no letters. Debt collectors had stopped showing up, which was its own kind of verdict. Sometimes Lena imagined he'd left the country. Other times she thought he was probably still in the city, invisible in a crowd, avoiding mirrors just like her. A week later, she passed by a shop window where the news played on a mounted TV. Ethan was there, standing on stage at the Innovation Summit, walking without crutches. The audience stood to applaud as he said, "What we build after pain isn't meant to prove we're strong. It's meant to prove we're still human." The camera caught his calm smile, his steady breath, And for the first time in a long while, Lena didn't feel anger or envy, just the hollow ache of understanding too late. She whispered to her reflection in the glass, "I was wrong." Then she turned and walked away before anyone could see the tears. That night, Ethan sat alone on his balcony, the city lights flickering beneath him like stars trapped under glass. Grace called to say she'd seen his speech. "You sounded like peace," she said. He laughed quietly. "Maybe it's just exhaustion." "No," she said. "It's the sound of a man who finally stopped bleeding." He looked at the skyline, at the tower that still bore his company's name, and thought about how it all began, with a woman, a door slammed in the rain, and a silence that grew teeth. He wasn't proud of what he'd done, but pride was a luxury for people who hadn't been rebuilt from ashes. Down in the streets, the same storm drain that had swallowed his ring months before still shimmered under the streetlight. The city kept every secret. It just changed the locks. As midnight neared, Ethan closed his laptop, finished his drink, and switched off the light. The reflection in the glass showed only the faint outline of a man standing again, after everyone thought he'd never rise. He whispered to the night, "You can lose everything and still win if you remember who you are." And as the city exhaled below him, taxis, sirens, distant laughter, Ethan Ward finally let go. Not with anger, not with triumph, but with something quieter, purer, and infinitely stronger. Peace, the kind that doesn't come when the storm passes, but when you finally stop waiting for it to return. By the next spring, Ward Tech had become more than a company. It was a symbol. News anchors called it the empire that rose from mercy. Ethan never corrected them. Let them believe it was mercy. Let the myth protect what truth could not. He spent his days walking through the innovation wing of the foundation. Children of factory workers ran down the corridors wearing prototype prosthetics, their laughter echoing off the walls like a language he'd forgotten he could understand. Each small sound was a kind of redemption that no courtroom or headline could ever give. Grace came by on weekends, always with coffee and stories about her son's school. She watched Ethan move easily now. No cane, no hesitation. "You don't look like a man who lost," she said once. He answered without smiling, "That's because I stopped keeping score." She looked at him carefully. "And her? She's part of the math that got me here." Across town, Lena lived in a neighborhood where no one recognized her last name. She worked 2 jobs and told people she'd moved to the city for a fresh start. Most nights, she came home to a one-room apartment with peeling paint and a window that overlooked the same skyline that used to belong to her. Sometimes she turned on the television just to hear his name. Ethan Ward giving another speech. Ethan Ward funding another recovery clinic. Ethan Ward shaking hands with senators and scientists. Each time she told herself she didn't care, but she still watched until the screen dimmed. One afternoon, she took a bus to the outskirts of the city. There on a quiet hill, she found the cemetery where Ethan's mother was buried. She had never been there before. She knelt by the headstone, brushing leaves away with trembling fingers. "I ruined him," she whispered, "but he survived me." The wind moved through the trees like a sigh. A few days later, at a charity event for Wardtech's new research program, a journalist asked Ethan a question that froze the room. "Mr. Ward, if you could speak to your ex-wife today, what would you say?" He paused. Cameras clicked. The audience waited. Finally, he said, "I'd thank her for leaving. Pain taught me discipline. Betrayal taught me clarity. Without her, I'd still think love was supposed to save people." The crowd went silent before erupting in applause, but Ethan didn't linger. He left through the back door, stepped into the cool night air, and exhaled. His words weren't for them. They were for himself. Later that night, as he drove home, he stopped at a traffic light near a diner glowing with neon blue. Through the window, he saw a woman wiping down tables, the curve of her shoulders unmistakable even after all this time. Lena looked older, smaller. The world had trimmed away every sharp edge she once used to wound him. For a moment, their eyes met through the glass. No anger, no pity, just recognition. 2 people who had finally run out of war. The light turned green. He didn't wave. She didn't move. The car rolled forward, and the distance between them became what it was always meant to be: permanent. Weeks turned into months. Ethan traveled less, spent more time by the sea. Sometimes he'd stand on the pier at dawn, watching the water move the way time does, relentless, unbothered, clean. The ocean didn't forgive, it just kept going. He found comfort in that. Grace visited him there once, asked if he'd ever love again. He smiled, eyes on the horizon. "I already do, just not anyone who can leave." At night, he sat on the balcony with a notebook, writing lines he'd never publish. Kindness is not weakness. Silence is not surrender. And loss, if you learn to use it, is the purest form of power. He tore the page out and let the wind take it. Somewhere in the city, Lena dreamed of the man she had thrown away. She saw him standing, smiling, untouchable. She woke up crying and couldn't remember if it was regret or gratitude that made her shake. And in the morning, when the first light spilled across the skyline, it glinted off the Wardtech tower like a crown no one could steal. Ethan Ward poured his coffee, looked out at the city that had once buried him, and whispered to the quiet, "You can't destroy a man who has nothing left to prove." Then he picked up his jacket, stepped into the sunlight, and walked, steady, certain, unstoppable, through a world that had finally learned his name. Ethan stood at the edge of the marina just before dawn, a soft breeze brushing against his face. The city behind him was only a blur of lights fading into gray. He'd learned to love mornings like this, when the world was quiet enough to forget what it had cost to buy that silence. A man who'd once been carried out of fire now walked on legs, forged by the company that rose from it. Each step clicked softly on the dock, a small mechanical heartbeat. He sat on a bench overlooking the water, coffee steaming in his hands. A seagull landed near his feet, pecking at a breadcrumb someone had dropped hours earlier. He smiled at the simple persistence of it, how everything that survived did so by refusing to quit. Grace arrived a few minutes later. "They want you in Washington next week," she said. "They're giving you the humanitarian award." He didn't look at her. "They give those to people who forgive." "You have forgiven," she said. He shook his head. "No, I've outgrown the need to." She sat beside him, watching the first blush of sunlight crawl over the horizon. "I saw her yesterday," she said quietly. He didn't have to ask who. Grace continued. "At the diner near 42nd, she looks tired, like someone waiting for an apology that'll never come." He took a sip of coffee. "Then she's waiting in the wrong direction." They sat in silence for a while, the kind that doesn't hurt anymore. When Grace left, he stayed there listening to the city wake up, the distant horns, the waves lapping against the pier, the low hum of life moving forward. Across town, Lena stood outside that same diner, tying her apron, the cold biting at her hands. She'd stopped checking her phone months ago. There were no messages left to wait for. When customers complained, she apologized softly, her voice stripped of its old edge. After work, she walked home past a billboard for Wardtech's new prosthetic line. It showed Ethan's face, calm and steady, above the words, "Strength isn't what you keep, it's what you rebuild." She stopped and stared until traffic forced her to move. In the years that followed, Ethan's company spread across continents, hospitals, rehabilitation centers, scholarships. He turned his pain into infrastructure. He turned betrayal into a business plan for healing. When journalists asked how he managed to keep compassion alive after everything, he always answered the same way. "Compassion's not about who deserves it, it's about who needs it." The world took it as wisdom. Grace knew it was something else entirely. Restraint. One winter morning, Ethan received a letter from an unknown sender. Inside was a small drawing in a child's hand, a stick figure man with two metal legs standing next to a tall building labeled Wardtech. Underneath it, in clumsy letters, "Thank you for helping my mom walk again." He stared at it for a long time. When he finally smiled, it wasn't the sharp, practiced one he used for cameras. It was small and real, the kind that softened his whole face. He pinned the drawing to his office wall above his first prototype, a reminder that revenge may end stories, but kindness starts them again. That night he walked home alone through light snow, the city quiet except for the sound of his footsteps. Every street he passed had a ghost in it. The house where Lena had slammed the door, the hospital where he'd learned to breathe through pain, the courthouse where silence had won him justice. Each place now felt less like a wound and more like proof. When he reached his building, he paused at the glass doors. His reflection looked older, yes, but unbroken. Behind him, the Ward Tech logo glowed across the street, its light washing the snow in silver. He whispered, almost to himself, "I was never poor. I was just investing in the right kind of wealth." Up in her apartment, Lena turned off the TV just as a reporter announced the company's latest milestone. For a moment, she stood by the window, watching that same silver glow in the distance. It was beautiful and cold and untouchable, just like him. She closed her eyes and whispered, "I hope he's happy." Ethan was, but not in the way people meant. His happiness wasn't joy, it was completion. He had lived long enough to see justice without bitterness, power without cruelty, and peace without forgetting. As the night deepened, he stood by the window of his office, the city glittering beneath him like a map of every choice he'd ever made. He raised a glass to the silence that had taught him everything. "Here's to what's gone," he said softly, "and to what never comes back." And when he drank, the sound was barely louder than a breath, the last echo of a man who lost the world and built a better one from its ashes. Ethan woke before the city did. A thin line of light was crawling up the horizon, brushing against the glass towers he'd once looked at from the ground. For years, mornings had been the hardest part of the day, quiet hours when memory whispered louder than the world. Now they were the calm between heartbeats. He stood on the balcony of his penthouse, the wind cool against his face, and watched the Ward Tech logo glow against the dawn. The city below moved slowly, its pulse steady, unaware of the man watching it rebuild itself. His company had grown into a global foundation. Rehabilitation centers, research labs, programs for the forgotten. What started as a way to survive had become a way to give others the chance he almost lost. Grace arrived with her usual knock and 2 cups of coffee. "You're up early." "I never really sleep," he said, half smiling. She looked at him closely. "You seem lighter." "Maybe because I finally stopped carrying ghosts." She handed him the 2nd cup. "They confirmed the date for the United Nations conference. They want you to speak about resilience." He leaned on the balcony rail, eyes still fixed on the skyline. "Resilience is a nice word for pain that learned manners." Grace smiled. "Then teach them that." That afternoon in the Ward Tech auditorium, a group of interns waited to meet him. They whispered as he entered, some barely older than the company itself. Ethan walked across the stage without support now, his gait even, his presence quiet but heavy. He spoke to them about patience, about building without hate. When someone asked how he found strength after betrayal, he paused long enough for silence to fill the room. "Betrayal," he said finally, "is a teacher. It shows you what to never become." They clapped, but he didn't stay to hear it. Applause, he had learned, never healed anything. Across the river, in a narrow apartment smelling faintly of coffee and soap, Lena folded laundry by hand. Her son watched television quietly, a news segment showing Ward Tech opening a new center in Chicago. Ethan's face filled the screen for a moment. The boy looked up. "Mom, isn't that the man who helps people walk again?" Lena's throat tightened. "Yes," she said softly. "He always did." After the broadcast, she went to the window, staring at the skyline she used to own. Somewhere out there, behind glass and light, was the man she had destroyed, and the man who refused to destroy her in return. That mercy was what broke her now. She touched the cold window pane, as if she could still feel his warmth through it. That night, Ethan attended the conference dinner. The hall glittered with politicians, investors, philanthropists. He shook hands, accepted compliments, but his mind was somewhere else, out there in the city where the world kept its quieter promises. Later, after the cameras, after the speeches, he stepped outside alone. Snow had begun to fall again, soft and steady. He walked until he reached the river, where the lights turned the water into molten silver, the same place he'd once thrown his ring, the same water that had carried it away. He thought of Lena, not with anger anymore, but with the detached kindness one might feel for a storm that had passed. She had been the lesson that built his discipline, the wound that became his foundation. A sound pulled him from his thoughts. Laughter. Across the river, a small group of workers were cleaning the sidewalk, joking with one another as snow gathered on their jackets. One of them was wearing a WardTech rehabilitation badge. Ethan watched them for a moment, then turned toward his car. On his desk at home, the child's drawing still hung above the prototype legs. "Thank you for helping my mom walk again." It was the only decoration in the room. He stared at it, feeling the faint warmth of something that might have been peace. He poured himself a drink, opened the window, and let the cold air roll through the room. The city hummed below him, alive, relentless, forgiving. Grace called to remind him of his next meeting. He said he'd be there. Then he sat down, looking out over the skyline one last time before sunrise. His reflection merged with the city's light, blurred until he looked almost weightless. "You can't outrun what's meant to teach you," he murmured, "but if you learn fast enough, it stops chasing." He closed his eyes and listened to the sound of the wind against the glass, a sound that no longer felt like emptiness, but completion. Somewhere far below, the world kept moving. Taxis, laughter, the echo of footsteps, the rhythm of a city that had buried its ghosts and built monuments from their bones. And above it all, the name Ethan Ward glowed quietly against the night. Not as a reminder of vengeance, but of what endurance becomes when it finally stops bleeding. Ethan Ward rose before sunrise, the skyline still sleeping beneath the pale blue wash of early morning. The glass walls of his penthouse caught the first light, scattering it across a space built not from vanity, but from purpose. Every object had meaning now, no luxury untouched by reason. He poured a cup of black coffee and stood by the window. From here, he could see everything. The hospital wing bearing his mother's name, the rehabilitation center full of people walking again because he refused to stay broken. The reflection of a man who had once been burned and left for dead, but rebuilt himself from the ashes of betrayal. The city didn't know the story the way he did. They saw him as an icon of perseverance, a symbol of strength. But Ethan knew what he really was, a man who had learned how to turn pain into architecture. The door opened softly behind him. Grace stepped in, the same sister who'd stood by him through every silence and storm. "Your car's ready," she said. "They're expecting you at the university groundbreaking." He didn't move. "Do you ever wonder if peace is just a quieter form of war?" Grace tilted her head. "You earned your peace, Ethan. Don't turn it into another battlefield." He gave a small nod. "I'm still learning how to live without the fight." They drove through downtown in silence. Billboards flashed with his company's new campaign, WardTech, Building Tomorrow's Strength. His face was everywhere, smiling that calm smile that had once been a mask. Now it was simply stillness. At the event, cameras followed his every step as he planted the first shovel of dirt. Applause rippled through the crowd. A reporter asked, "Mr. Ward, what drives you to keep expanding these programs?" He looked up, his expression unreadable. "Because broken things don't fix themselves. Someone has to decide they're worth the effort." That night after the ceremony, Ethan walked alone through the empty lobby of the WardTech Tower. He paused before a portrait that hung beside the elevators. Him and Lena, taken 10 years ago, when the company was new and hope was still untested. Her smile was the kind that used to make people believe she loved him. He stared at it for a long time, then quietly reached for his phone. "Thomas," he said when his lawyer answered, "remove that portrait from the archives. Replace it with the workers who rebuilt after the explosion." "Done," Thomas said. "Everything else all right?" Ethan exhaled. "Everything's exactly as it should be." Across the city in a small apartment, Lena finished another late shift at the diner. She washed her hands, unpinned her hair, and sat on the edge of the bed. The television played softly in the background, a business segment about WardTech's latest global initiative. The reporter called Ethan a man who turned pain into power. Lena muted the sound but couldn't look away from the screen. Her reflection appeared beside his image in the glass, faint and ghost-like. She touched her cheek and whispered, "He finally found peace." The words felt like a confession and a sentence all at once. She opened an old box from under the bed. Inside were photos, court papers, and a letter she never sent. "I didn't love you right," it began. She folded it again, sealed it in an envelope, and walked to the window. Below, the streetlights flickered in the drizzle. She didn't mail it. Some stories, she thought, end more honestly when they stay unfinished. Back at the tower, Ethan stood in his office long after everyone had gone home. The city was alive beneath him, taxis threading through wet streets, neon signs pulsing like veins. He raised a glass of scotch and watched the light bend through it, gold and fleeting. He thought of all the nights he'd stayed awake, burning with revenge, how it used to be his oxygen, how somewhere along the way it had become unnecessary. He whispered into the stillness, "You win when you no longer need to." He placed the glass down, turned off the lights, and walked out, his footsteps soft and deliberate. Outside, snow began to fall again, the same quiet kind that had filled the night she left him. The difference was, this time, it didn't sting. It felt like closure. Far below, a billboard flickered against the skyline. Ward Tech, born from kindness, built for strength. Ethan stopped at the curb, looked up at it once, and smiled. Not because of pride, but because he finally understood what it meant. Kindness wasn't what made him weak. It was what made him impossible to destroy. And as he walked into the snowfall, disappearing into the hum of a city that once buried him, Ethan Ward became what every survivor hopes to be, a man who no longer needed to look back to prove he'd moved on. Ethan stood on the observation deck of the new Ward Tech Tower, 50 floors above the noise he'd once lived inside. The city looked different from here, smaller, almost gentle, as if distance could turn chaos into pattern. The glass in front of him reflected the man he had become, straight-backed, clear-eyed, a quiet storm that had finally learned to rest. Below, people hurried through the morning light, unaware that every clinic, every rehab center, every scholarship stamped with the Ward Tech logo had begun with a man sitting in a wheelchair, staring at loss until it gave up its secrets. Grace joined him. "They're ready for you," she said. He nodded and turned toward the conference room where dozens of young engineers waited to meet him. Their notebooks were open, their eyes wide. When he spoke, his voice carried the calm of a man who had already survived the worst. "Everyone wants to build something that lasts," he said, "but you can't build anything real until you've learned how easily things break. Strength isn't about never falling. It's about standing up quieter than you fell." They listened the way people do when they sense truth stripped of decoration. He thanked them and left before the applause began. That afternoon, he drove out past the edge of the city. The sky was the color of steel. Rain hung heavy in the air. He parked near the old factory lot, the ground where Ward Tech had nearly died before it was born again. The fire scars were gone, replaced by a research lab full of laughter and humming machines. He walked the perimeter slowly, boots pressing into the wet soil. Every step was both memory and promise. Inside the lab, a young woman on prosthetics was learning to walk again. She stumbled, caught herself, then looked up at him, embarrassed. He smiled. "You're already winning," he said. She didn't know who he was, and he preferred it that way. As he left, he passed the spot where he'd once lain broken after the explosion. The ghost of that moment still lingered, but now it felt like part of the foundation rather than a wound. He looked up at the new building and whispered, "Worth it." That night, the city glittered with rain. In a small apartment across the river, Lena folded another stack of uniforms. The television murmured about Ward Tech's new humanitarian program. She didn't turn up the volume. She didn't need to hear his voice to know it. Every headline, every smiling photo, every quiet success story reminded her that the man she left behind had outgrown even her imagination. Her son slept in the next room. He had Ethan's calm eyes, though Ethan would never know. She kissed the boy's forehead and whispered, "Learn from me. Don't chase gold that turns to glass." Back at the tower, Ethan stood on his balcony, rain dripping from the railing. Grace called to say the board had approved another expansion. "Congratulations, brother," she said. "You've changed the world." He looked at the skyline. "No," he said softly. "I just stopped letting it change me." The line went quiet. She understood. He stayed outside long after the call ended, the rain soaking his shirt, the city a blur of light below. For years he'd dreamed of this feeling, No fury, no hunger, no ghosts whispering through the night. Just balance. In the distance, lightning flashed over the river, illuminating the faint curve of the Ward Tech sign. His name carried across the skyline like a quiet oath. He raised his glass toward it, the amber liquid catching the light. "To the ones who broke me," he said, "you taught me what not to be." He drank, the sound lost in the wind. Then he turned, walking back inside, leaving the door open so the rain could wash through the room. Outside, the world kept moving. Cars, laughter, the hum of lives beginning and ending in the same breath. And somewhere buried in that motion, the story of Ethan Ward had already become legend. The man who was betrayed, rebuilt, and then built a world where no one would have to break the way he once did. He didn't need forgiveness. He didn't need revenge. He had something rarer, the kind of peace that hums quietly at the center of strength. Ethan Ward woke to the sound of the city breathing below him. Steady, alive, unbothered. Morning light spilled through the glass walls of his penthouse, catching the edges of his desk, the silver frames, the single photograph that had somehow survived every purge. He walked to the window. From here, New York looked like it was bowing to him, but he knew better. The city bowed to no one. It only mirrored what you were brave enough to build. Years had passed since the courtroom, since the day he reclaimed his name and left behind every piece of what once was. He'd built an empire of steel and mercy, and in doing so, he had done something rarer. He had made peace with power. His phone buzzed. "Grace, they're waiting," she said softly. "You're late for the award ceremony." He smiled. "You know I don't care for applause." "I know," she said, "but this one's for you, not your company." He looked at the skyline again, quiet for a moment. "Then I'll go. For her." The drive through Manhattan felt unreal. Billboards carried his company's new campaign. Ward Tech, the strength of second chances. Every word was a truth he'd bled for. At the event, the mayor spoke of him as if he were a saint, a man who turned loss into legacy. The crowd rose to their feet as he took the stage. Cameras flashed. For a second, the light was blinding. And he remembered another flash, years ago, when Lena had smiled beside him at a different podium, her hand on his arm, her love rehearsed for the cameras. Now, standing alone, he said only 6 words. "Forgiveness is expensive. I paid in full." The room fell silent, and then applause, thunderous, honest. But he didn't linger. He left the stage, stepping out into the cold night air. Outside, the world smelled of rain and possibility. He loosened his tie and walked. No entourage, no car, no noise. He stopped at the edge of the river. The same river that had swallowed his wedding ring years ago. The city lights shimmered on the water, bending and shifting like time itself. Somewhere behind him, in a quieter part of town, Lena stood on the balcony of her small apartment, her hair uncombed, her apron still tied. She had just finished another shift, her hands red from soap and heat. She looked out toward that same river and wondered if he still thought of her. She whispered into the night, "I hope he's happy." Across the river, Ethan whispered back to the darkness, "I am." He wasn't thinking of revenge anymore. Revenge was too small for what he'd built. What filled him now was something quieter, a kind of stillness that didn't need witnesses. He closed his eyes and listened to the city. The same city that had watched him crawl, break, rise, and finally stop running. The wind shifted, carrying the hum of traffic, the rhythm of life. The soft reminder that everything, love, pain, empire, eventually dissolves back into time. He turned away from the water, walking slowly toward the lights, his reflection flickering in every rain-slicked window. For the first time, he saw himself not as a survivor or a victim, but as a man who had finished his story. And as he disappeared into the glow of the city he had rebuilt, the words he left behind were written only in silence. Kindness is not weakness. Silence is not surrender. And sometimes the loudest revenge is peace that never ends.